My daughter looked me in the eye at the kitchen table of the house I had built with my own hands and said, "Either you sign the business over to us by Friday, or you find somewhere else to live." She said it the way you'd tell someone the dishwasher's full. No hesitation, no apology. Just a statement of fact, like she'd rehearsed it 100 times and finally decided today was the day. I'm Gordon. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years building a small accounting firm in Kelowna, British Columbia, the kind of business where you know your clients by name and their kids' names and whether they prefer their coffee black or with 2 creams. I retired 2 years ago just after my wife Elaine passed. Lung cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to the end. I was in the house alone after that, rattling around in 4 bedrooms and a sunroom that still smelled like her hand cream. My daughter had come home for the memorial with her husband. They stayed 2 weeks, which at the time felt like kindness. She talked about how worried she was about me, out here alone. She talked about how the house was too much for one person. She talked about how it would be good for the grandchildren, when they had some, to grow up with family close by. I hadn't heard any of it as a plan. I'd heard it as love. So I sold the firm. Not the name, just the client book and the staff, to a regional accounting chain out of Kamloops. Took what I got for it, added my savings, and used it all to buy into a bigger property just outside of town. A Victorian in West Kelowna, proper ceilings, a porch that wrapped around the side, a yard with apple trees. The kind of house Elaine would have called ridiculous in the best possible way. I put in $600,000. My daughter and her husband put in nothing. Their names went on the title of the house. Mine went on a family trust agreement that Patrick, my old lawyer, had drawn up. I kept the land. My daughter's husband had a job in Vancouver that he was going to transfer from. My daughter said she'd been wanting to start a catering business for years, and now she finally could. I would have the main floor bedroom, the one with the garden door. That was the deal. That was the whole deal. For the first few months, it was fine. Not warm, exactly, but functional. We had dinner together most nights. I walked the yard in the mornings. I tried not to be in the way. I told myself this was what family looked like when everybody was being practical about it. I noticed things slowly, the way you notice a leak, a drip here, a damp patch there. The catering business never started. There were a lot of conversations in low voices that stopped when I came into the room. My daughter's husband, Nathan, was on his phone constantly, not in the distracted way people get with social media, but in the tight, focused way of someone managing something. He'd go outside to take calls. I didn't ask. I figured it was work. Then the Friday came. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. The dishes hadn't been cleared yet. My daughter had a glass of wine in front of her. Nathan was standing near the counter with his arms crossed, which I now understand was the posture of a man who had decided to let his wife do the hard part. She told me the catering business wasn't viable without more capital. She told me my firm, the name, the 30 years of goodwill I'd built, was still worth something if relaunched properly. She wanted to register it under a new corporate structure, under their names. She wanted me to sign the intellectual property and the client relationships I still held in the trust over to a numbered company Nathan had registered in Alberta. I asked why Alberta. She said it was for tax purposes. I asked who was advising them on tax purposes, because as a CPA with 3 decades of experience, I could think of no reason a small business in BC would benefit from a shell company in Alberta, unless the goal was to make it harder to trace. She didn't answer that. I told her I needed to think about it. That's when Nathan pushed off the counter and walked over and stood beside her, and she looked at me and said what she said. Either sign the business over by Friday or find somewhere else to live. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at my daughter. This woman I had driven to soccer practice and helped through 3 university applications and sat with in a hospital waiting room when she'd had a miscarriage 2 years before Elaine got sick. I looked at her and I said, "All right, I'll think about it." I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I could hear them in the kitchen, not the words, just the tone. It was the tone of people who thought the hard part was over. I didn't sleep much, but somewhere around 2 in the morning, I stopped feeling hurt and started thinking like an accountant. Because I was still an accountant, I had just spent 32 years teaching myself to find the thing people were hiding inside a set of numbers. I knew what a shell company in Alberta looked like when it wasn't for tax purposes. I knew what it looked like when someone needed a clean asset, hard to trace, receivable in cash. The question was what they needed it for. I started paying attention differently after that, not angrily, just carefully. I began collecting the mail before my daughter came downstairs. I started noting the names on packages. Nathan had things delivered to our address that were addressed to 2 other names I didn't recognize, a corporate name and a numbered company different from the Alberta one he'd mentioned. I wrote them down. One morning, a registered letter arrived from RBC. It was addressed to Nathan alone. I held it for a long time. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I opened it. It was a notice of default on a personal line of credit, $140,000. The account was 3 months past due. I sat down at the kitchen table with a letter in my hand, and I did the accounting in my head the way I'd done it for other people's messes for 30 years. The Alberta company, the shell accounts, the default notice, the pressure to get my firm's name and client book transferred before Friday. They weren't building something. They were liquidating. They were going to take what I had spent 30 years building, attach it to a corporate structure they controlled, run it for 18 months at most, and dissolve it before the creditors caught up. My clients would be collateral damage. My name would be on something I had never authorized. I called Patrick that afternoon from my car, parked on the side of Lakeshore Drive with the window down and the lake going gray in the November light. Patrick had been my lawyer since I opened the firm. He was the kind of man who wore the same 3 ties in rotation and remembered the name of your late wife without being prompted. I told him everything, about the Friday ultimatum, about the letter, about the numbered companies. He was quiet for most of it. Then he said, "Gordon, pull up the trust agreement on your end. Go to Schedule B, the right of reversion clause." I had written that clause myself, or rather I had insisted on it, and Patrick had written it properly. It said that the land underlying the West Kelowna property remained in the Gordon Harold Flett Family Trust, and that any attempt to encumber, transfer, or leverage the property without the trustees' written consent constituted a material breach, triggering full reversion of all interests to the trust within 60 days. Patrick said the default notice is a form of material encumbrance by association. Their debt is attached to this property as far as RBC is concerned. They listed it as a household asset on Nathan's line of credit application. I asked him how he knew that. He said he didn't know it for certain, but the timing and the pressure made it the most probable explanation, and if I wanted to find out for sure, I should let them think they'd won. So that's what I did. On Thursday evening, I told my daughter I'd been thinking about it, and she was probably right, that holding on to the firm's name was just sentiment, and that maybe it was time to let go. I watched her face go through a sequence of expressions she was working very hard to keep neutral. Relief came first, then something that looked, briefly, like guilt, then the neutral mask again. She hugged me. It felt like being thanked by someone who had already spent the money. I told her I'd need a day or two to gather the paperwork. She said, "Of course, no rush, take the time I needed." I packed one bag. I told her I was going to drive up to Penticton for a few days to visit my old colleague Bruce, get some air, clear my head before signing anything. She walked me to the door with the same bright energy she'd had when I'd agreed to move in. The same performance of affection as a transaction completed. I drove 40 minutes south, checked into the waterfront inn, and called Patrick. 3 days later, registered letters arrived at the West Kelowna property, sent by process server to both my daughter and Nathan. Breach of trust. Material encumbrance without consent. Formal notice of reversion. They had 60 days to vacate the property, during which time no further encumbrances, transfers, or corporate activities involving the address were permitted. Failure to comply would result in immediate transfer of all interests, including the structure, to the Gordon Harold Flett Family Trust. They called me within the hour, both of them, separately. Nathan called first. His voice had the focused, controlled quality of a man who'd been in bad situations before and knew how to manage them. He said there had been a misunderstanding about the line of credit. He said the property had been listed as an asset by accident, that he'd told the bank not to include it. He said they could sort this out like adults. I said I was sure they could and that Patrick would be happy to discuss it. My daughter called 11 minutes later. She didn't use Nathan's tone. She used mine, the one I'd used when she was 17 and had taken my car without asking and tried to pretend she hadn't. Reasonable, slightly wounded, a little disappointed. She said she couldn't believe I would do this to her. She said she thought we were family. She said Elaine would be heartbroken. That one landed. I won't pretend it didn't. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a while after she said Elaine's name. I looked at the wall. I thought about what Elaine would actually say if she were here, not as a rhetorical device in an argument, but actually. Elaine had loved our daughter fiercely and without reservation, the way she loved things, completely. But Elaine had also been a woman who kept her accounts straight. She had managed our household budget for 30 years with the same rigor she applied to everything else. She would not have signed anything on a Thursday to avoid a fight on a Friday. I picked the phone back up and called Patrick. I told him to proceed. Here's what I found out over the next 2 weeks, through Patrick's contacts and a private investigator he used for estate disputes. Nathan had been terminated from his Vancouver job 8 months before they moved in with me, not transferred. There was no transfer. He had been managing a portfolio of micro-investments, some of which had gone badly, and some of which had attracted the interest of the BC Securities Commission. The Alberta Numbered Company was registered to a business partner of Nathan's who had been the subject of a prior complaint. The plan, as best Patrick and the investigator could reconstruct it, was to use my firm's name and client base, which had real value, to generate the appearance of a legitimate ongoing business, run invoices through it, and pay down the personal line of credit before the bank called it. My clients would have received invoices from what looked like my firm for services they hadn't requested. Some of them were elderly. Some of them had been with me for 20 years. My daughter's involvement was harder to establish. She may have understood all of it. She may have understood only that they needed the firm's name and had decided not to ask why. I am 67 years old, and I have done enough personal tax returns to know that not asking why is its own kind of answer. The 60-day notice period passed. They did not vacate voluntarily. On day 61, Patrick filed for enforcement. My daughter called me 4 times that day. I let it go to voicemail. The calls went from angry to pleading to quiet and lost, which was the hardest to listen to. The last message she left was 3 minutes of silence with her breathing in it, and then she said, "Dad, I don't know what we're going to do." I called her back that evening. I was on the hotel porch by then. November turned to January. A cold white sky over the lake, ice on the rocks below. She answered on the first ring. I let her talk. She told me Nathan had left. She said she'd found out about the BC Securities complaint the same week the reversion notice arrived, which I believed and didn't believe at the same time. She said she had known things were bad, but hadn't known how bad. She said she was sorry. She said it several times. Each time it sounded more like she meant it, and less like she was trying to accomplish something with it. When she went quiet, I spoke. I told her that sorry was a starting point, not a destination. I told her I had spent 32 years building something that had my name on it, and that my name was the only thing I had any right to protect because it wasn't mine alone. It was also her mother's name, and the name of every client who had trusted me with their financial life. I told her I was not going to negotiate that way, not on a Friday, not ever. Then I told her that she was still my daughter. I told her there was a one-bedroom apartment above a garage on the Penticton property Patrick had been managing for the trust, a rental unit that had just come vacant. She could stay there for 3 months, free, long enough to get her footing. After that, she would pay market rent. If she wanted to work, I knew an accountant in Summerland who needed a bookkeeper and was willing to train someone, and I would give the referral. That was it. That was the offer. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why would you do that for me after everything?" I said, "I'm not doing it for you. I am doing it because your mother would have done it, and I made a promise to keep doing the things she would have done." She came to Penticton 3 weeks later with 2 bags and a box of kitchen things. She looked thin. She looked like someone who had been sleeping badly and eating worse. She looked, in other words, like someone who had hit the actual ground and was only now starting to take stock of where she'd landed. I helped her carry the box up the stairs. I didn't stay for tea. I didn't think that was what the moment needed. I've been in a 2-bedroom condo on Abbott Street since February. Elaine would have found it too small and too modern and would have immediately started talking about what plants to put on the balcony. I bought 2 ferns and a small olive tree in her honor. I sit with my coffee in the mornings and look at the lake, and I think about what it cost to get here. It cost me $600,000 and a year of my life, and something with my daughter that may or may not grow back. The numbered company in Alberta was dissolved. Nathan's situation was referred to the BCSC. I got my firm's name and client relationships back into the trust, where they will stay until I decide what to do with them properly. The West Kelowna house sold in March, 5-bedroom Victorian in West Kelowna in a low-inventory spring market. It went in 9 days for $940,000. After the outstanding property taxes and Patrick's fees and a small amount I set aside for my daughter's rental subsidy, the trust came out ahead of where I started. Not by much, but ahead. My daughter called me last week. We talked for 40 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation, but it was an honest one, which is more than I could say for most of what passed between us in that West Kelowna kitchen. She's working. She's paying the rent. She asked me how the ferns were doing. I told her one of them was struggling, but the other was fine. She said that sounded about right. I have been asked by people who know this story whether I feel like I won. I don't think won is the right word. I protected what I had a responsibility to protect. I let the structure fall when the structure was rotten, and I tried to leave one door open. Not because she deserved it and not because it was comfortable, but because you don't get to decide who your family is once you've already decided. And I'd made that decision a long time ago in a maternity ward in Kelowna General with Elaine's hand in mine. If there's a lesson in it, here it is. Never let love make you careless with paperwork. The people who hurt you the most can only do it if you've handed them the tools. I didn't stop trusting my daughter because I put a reversion clause in a trust agreement. I put a reversion clause in a trust agreement because I had spent 32 years watching what happens when people trust each other without reading what they've signed. Turns out that lesson doesn't stop applying just because the people across the table are family. Sometimes it applies more. I've been sitting on my balcony most mornings lately, coffee in hand, watching the light come up over Okanagan Lake. It's quiet here. Genuinely quiet. The kind you don't notice until you've spent months in a house where every silence felt like something being hidden from you. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it ended. I don't think regret is quite the right word. What I feel is closer to a long exhale, the kind that comes after you've been holding your breath without realizing it. Here's what I know now that I didn't fully understand before all of this. The choices people make have a weight to them, and sooner or later, that weight lands somewhere. Nathan made choices that had been accumulating for years before he ever walked into my kitchen and stood with his arms crossed while my daughter issued an ultimatum. Those choices had a momentum. They were always going to land on someone. What I had to decide was whether it was going to land on me, on my clients, on 32 years of work that had Elaine's fingerprints all over it as much as mine. I decided it wasn't. What protected me wasn't luck. It was something I'd built deliberately, not just the reversion clause in the trust agreement, but the habit of mind that made me insist on it in the first place. 32 years of accounting teaches you that the most expensive mistakes people make are the ones they make when they're tired or grieving or lonely and just want someone to tell them it's going to be fine. I was all three of those things when I moved into that West Kelowna house. I knew I was. And I put the clause in anyway, because knowing your own vulnerability and protecting yourself from it anyway is, I think, one of the more honest things a person can do. My daughter made her own choices too. I've had to sit with that. She chose not to ask the questions she should have asked. She chose to use Elaine's name as a lever in an argument. She chose to stand in a kitchen she didn't pay for and tell me to leave a house I had built. Those are her choices, and she owns them. But she also chose to answer the phone when I called. She chose to take the apartment in Penticton. She chose to go to work every morning for a man in Summerland who doesn't care about her last name or what her husband was involved in. I notice those choices too. What I keep coming back to is this: it's not enough to be a good person in the comfortable moments. The test is what you do when you're scared and exhausted and someone you love is asking you to compromise something you know you shouldn't compromise. Nathan failed that test repeatedly and quietly, over years, in ways that eventually became impossible to hide. My daughter failed it in a kitchen on a Thursday evening. I almost failed it myself, sitting on the edge of a bed in a hotel room, thinking about Elaine's name in my daughter's mouth. The difference, I think, was that I'd spent enough years watching what happens to people who sign things they don't understand, who hand over what they've built because the room is uncomfortable and the other person seems very certain. I knew what that cost looked like on paper. I knew it in my bones, and when the moment came, that knowledge held. I'm not telling the story because I think I handled it perfectly. I didn't. There are things I would have said differently and moments I wish I could have back. But I'm here, on a balcony, with a good cup of coffee, and the firm's name is still in the trust where it belongs. My daughter called me last Thursday. She paid her rent on the 1st of the month. The fern on the left is still struggling, but I've moved it closer to the window and I think it might come around. Sometimes that's the best you can do. You protect what matters. You leave a door open and you see what grows.